Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 10th episode of Mind Your Body. Woohoo! I'm glad we made it this far, and if you've been listening this entire time, I want to thank you so much for dedicating your time and your interest into this podcast. If you've just kind of found out about this and are beginning to listen, welcome, and thank you so much for giving it a shot. Leave a review or a rating on whatever platform you're listening on. I would greatly appreciate that. Feel free to send me feedback or comments or suggestions for anything else you'd like to hear. You can do that through the Mind Your Body Facebook page. Just go to Facebook and search Mind Your Body, a dance movement therapy perspective. And let's talk about today's episode. I had an interview with Amber Gray. Amber is a dance movement therapist and a practitioner of other body-centered arts and sciences and has worked for almost 20 years with people who have survived human rights abuses, wars, natural disasters, and has also worked with humanitarian response teams. You can find a brief bio in the episode summary. I hardly think that it describes the huge amount of amazing work that Amber has done around the world, and I'm excited to share this interview with you. I especially love the way that Amber presented very real topics, very important topics for us right now, and how she has challenged these huge global conflicts in the past and still does to this day, and advises us on how we can use our own body knowledge and body awareness to do the same. This is Mind Your Body, a dance movement therapy perspective on the integration of our emotional, cognitive, physical, and spiritual aspects of our being into one more aware and whole existence. Hello.
Hi.
So again, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to allow me to interview you and share your story and your work with people listening to this podcast. And I wanted to know if you could take us on a brief journey of how you found your specialty in dance movement therapy.
Let's see how I found it. It actually is a journey how I found my specialty in dance movement therapy. And I think it's a journey it's like a river with multiple tributaries, or a road with a bunch of different exits and entries. But I think it started with always loving to dance, and not necessarily in dance classes, but in very freeform ways. I used to just love to dance to wind or rain. So I think there was a sense of the nourishment and the healing and the self-discovery or the self-expression that dance is for me, in a very meaningful and embodied way. It's not something anybody ever suggested or, told me to do. It's just something that I always did. And then I think another aspect, my dad, I often quote this, but when I had to interview him for a class that I was taking in somatic psychology on early childhood and on my birth, he said that I was born dancing and fighting and never stopped. And I think we all come in with some sort of, blueprint for who we are that's very flexible and malleable, but mine definitely had to do with human rights and animal rights, probably both. Then personal experiences. I was also drawn to travel. I'm not sure where that came from because I don't come from a family that ever did a lot of travel and didn't do a lot of traveling as a child, but I dreamed about traveling. And as I started to travel, Peace Corps Guatemala during years when there was a lot of violence, there was still a civil war, things I was exposed to there, people's experiences, they were still fighting in some areas. And then I was in Honduras during the Iran-Contra situation, different things that happened politically. And, I remember some mysterious disappearances and things like that. So just being exposed to and being informed by the things I was exposed to. And then as I was, going through international relations is what I got my bachelor's in, and then public health I got a master's in, and then I went and studied bodywork and herbal medicine because I got very interested in natural healing in some of the countries that I lived in. So they all just kind of came together, and I think I just recognized that there was one more piece that I wanted to add to my quote unquote education and career. And it had to do with working individually or in groups of people, not doing big public health, countrywide plans and things like that, but working more with people. And it was dance therapy. I looked at everything from acupuncture to clinical psychology to medicine. And it was dance movement therapy because of, I think my personal relationship to dance, and then experiences I had in Rwanda right immediately following the genocide, where I encountered dance and watched people rediscover each other after months of separation and not knowing if the other had lived or not. I mean, I would literally see people come together, say, oh my gosh, you survived. And the role of dance and music in a lot of that. There was a lot of creative expression. So that inspired me. Then once I became a dance movement therapist, things have also evolved in terms of how the world has met the work. I mean, I've been very intentional and bold about wanting to bring it to places where it doesn't easily exist, and finding that there's a lot of receptivity if it's adjusted in appropriate to the context. I think I was very naive in the beginning about that, but have made a lot of adjustments.
Yeah, that really does sound like a journey.
It is, and there's some very personal experiences along the journey. I mean, there's so many of them, but Rwanda was one of them. A particular village where children, after a very difficult journey, where children we didn't speak each other's language, welcomed me with little tin can shards and made music and danced, and that outreach, using whatever shards of material there was to make some kind of sound was pretty profound.
Mm-hmm. It sounded like a natural inclination for them to express themselves, with whatever resource they could.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was reading a previous interview of yours. It was a transcript of an interview, and you had said that when you began to introduce body and movement into the torture treatment model, your medically focused colleagues were not such believers. So could you tell us what your obstacles were and about the specific results that your clients experienced that inspired a shift in your colleagues' perspectives?
It's going back quite a while. So the early roots of torture treatment, and very appropriately so, was medical model. I think a lot of that really arose from the fact that most survivors of torture don't self-identify, and they don't go to therapists or to psychologists or to anybody looking for quote unquote psychotherapy or mental health treatment. They usually show up in medical clinics or hospitals with physical pain or perceived medical issues that don't go away. And test after test after test, there's no medical cause, there's no medical etiology. So some of my really beloved colleagues who were part of, those who initially recognized there's something going on here, and then would often find physical scars, but often the torturers don't leave physical scars very intentionally. They intentionally leave emotional and mental and psychological scars, deep imprints on the psyche. So it was kind of born in that context, the more medical. And so in the late 90s, dance movement therapy, this was probably as a lot of the research was beginning. Dan Siegel, but especially Dr. Van der Kolk and Dr. Porges, the research that they've done. There's Bruce Perry, other scientific researchers or clinical scientists who really started to recognize the role of the body in trauma, and, what happens with memory, why traumatic memory is as fragmented and sensory motoric and image-based as it is. And then questions about, well, what does that mean in terms of treatment, and the recognition that to work with trauma, you have to work with the body. Dance therapists, we've known forever that movement was not forever, but since the 40s in the United States, but as long as cultures and civilizations and ancient places of dance, there's been a recognition that movement is a language. So I think all of that coming together, it was like a parallel journey where the more this research was coming out and the more awareness, there was an endorsement from one of the primary or dominant paradigms in the modern society, which is science. I don't necessarily think that we always have to go by what science says, but it seems to be what people listen to in our society. So I think I was very mindfully tracking this and connecting with some of the researchers, met some of them, intentionally asked some very, I would say, provocative and direct questions to Stephen Porges, and we've done a fair amount of collaboration since on developing polyvagal informed dance movement therapy. So there was a parallel process occurring where dance movement therapy, which was an alternative, or not even adjunct, an alternative therapies, one of those artistic things that is no scientific, there's no evidence base for it, was starting to emerge along with other somatic therapies and arts-based therapies as probably the most likely to address the many needs and the very deep roots that trauma takes in the body, as an approach working with survivors of trauma. So in the early days, I don't remember any specific examples, but feeling a little bit like, wow, I'm treading water. I'm going to have to get up here. So really educating myself, really reaching out, being very persistent, sometimes to the point of being obnoxious, I'm sure, pushing, insisting on giving presentations at our annual clinical meetings, insisting on introducing my colleagues to the work, actually doing experientials with them, sometimes taking some crap from people and just continuing to push. One can't take it personally, those kinds of, dismissals, but I do think that the scientists were starting to recognize the power of this work. And I think I've done a fairly reasonable job of bridging those communities with language. And I think some of that is because I don't come from just a straight expressive background. I have public health, I have international relations, a lot of political science, economics. So I kind of used a lot of my mainstream education to bridge the gap language-wise to the dominant field, which was science and mainstream psychology as well. And, started to intentionally develop theories that would support the use of body-based and movement-based therapies with political torture.
Mm-hmm. It's nice to hear what an advocate you had to be, and sounds inspiring to me, and I think would be to others, how hard you have to work to really...
Well, yeah. And one of the things that I would say, I have been at conferences where people go, great presentation, where's the evidence base? Is this evidence based? And what I always invite people to do is say, the evidence is in your body. Where would you actually be? Where do you experience your own life? Where do your feelings reside? What tells you when something's wrong? And, but now we can point to a lot of the research that's going on. But, and I also point out that evidence-based clinical trials, they tend to be focused on very specific symptoms. And what they show is that one approach might be better than another at alleviating or maybe eliminating those symptoms. Nobody's really looked at, globally. 20 years from now, is that person's life meaningful? Have they restored their sense of where they belong in the world, their sense of meaningful connection with others? What are the things that really matter in life? It's important to reduce symptoms of anxiety or PTSD, but that's part of a much bigger global humanitarian presentation that we all are. So evidence-based is very micro-focused, in my opinion.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you, I wanted people to hear from you why it's important to include the body in trauma work. And I think you just talked a little bit about that. So maybe specify, how does the body remember trauma, and how do you help people access memories from the body safely?
I'm not a scientist, so I'll speak from my clinical experience, and which integrates what I've learned from the research. But my sense is that I don't know if our body actually holds memories. I don't know that there's a place that they're intact in the body, but it's like shards of experience. Antonio Damasio writes about it so beautifully in Descartes' Error, when he talks about somatic markers and how the brain actually, this is, almost catalogs things that happen. And, we know the brain is a pattern addict in a sense. That's a crass way to say it, but the brain will go, feels like this again, this feeling, this smell, this, the texture of this, whatever it is, the color, must be this again. So understanding that memories get encoded in the limbic system, amygdala, and then there's a real affective quality to it, less cognitive, less narrative. I always like to talk about it in terms of dimensionality. When we're in, it would a socially engaged state would be the polyvagal, but when we're living, when everything's okay, when we're in our groove, when we were quite dimensional. We could feel something. We might be able to have an abstract thought. We might, or think about something abstract. We might be able to appreciate a painting, write down the list of what we need to get at the grocery. The minute danger steps in, we feel fear, and that reduces our dimensionality, and it's more of an emotional experience. It's based on fear. There's not as much variability. And so that's where I think some of those shards of memory emerge. Hippocampal flooding, cortisol flooding the hippocampus, in my understanding that, again, I'm not a scientist, but those flashbulb memories start to be those shards of strong images, the sensory experience of whatever we're going through. And then in shutdown states, when it's a life threat situation and we completely shut down, there can be, almost no recollection. I mean, there may be somewhere. I've had people say, when they start to come out of those states, they might think they remember something, but people actually, I think, can shut down. The behavioral term is dissociate to the extent that they actually don't remember anything. That's where a lot of survivors of torture get challenged when they're seeking asylum. How can you not remember what happened? Well, of course you don't remember. If you're in a complete shutdown and you're in heart rate's really dropped and respiration, and you're in what I consider almost a shocky state, there may be no memory. So accessing those memories is challenging because a lot of them, I always say, it's like the body is both a minefield and it's refuge. So somewhere in the body, there are the places that the gardens grow that have really benevolent memories and maybe something positive from childhood, the animals I loved, smells, of my mother cooking, those things that, and some people call those body memories. There's, I can't remember her name. There's a dance therapist, and then trauma memories are like those shrapnel-like shards that happen in that loss of dimensionality, and I'm just focusing on somebody coming towards me or what the room smells like. So I look at it as really building a strong resource base, and I think that's fairly well accepted now. Although I think some exposure-based therapies kind of want to go right in. I think it's important to help my clients recognize what's helped them survive, what's kept them strong, and then build on that. And as memories pop up, I remember I studied acupuncture years ago. I apprenticed, and I remember the teacher telling me, in Chinese medicine, we work with what's emergent, what's right there. We might suspect we know what's the root cause of the rash or the headaches or whatever it is, but we work through layers. And that's how I approach working with traumatic memories. Something keeps coming up, whether it's a flash of an image or a person who's haunting somebody's dreams, or they say, I can't forget when I, heard the explosion, and they have a particular memory. I'll go with what comes up, and it's kind of a weaving. I call it weaving the narrative, and I really work with slowing time down, the sensate level, the affective feeling level, cognitive, and it's kind of like putting a puzzle back together and constantly coming back to present moment. What are you noticing now? What are you feeling now? I think that's really important to integrate it. I think that's when it actually becomes a memory, and then the person can say, okay, yeah, that is a memory, and being able to place it in the past, that's the integration. It's no longer hijacking that shard of whatever fear that I felt. It's a memory now. So I almost say when it becomes a memory, it's less of an issue. It's still an issue, but it's less of an issue than the shattered shards that make the memories. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So instead of these shards of memory, you're kind of making some space, separating the memory and almost observing it more than letting it take control over you. Is that what you mean?
That's part of it, but I don't think often we don't have the whole memory. It's like we have a strong sense, a smell triggers an image or a piece of something that happened. I remember the door opening, but I'm not sure I remember what happened to that. I woke up and, he was on top of me. I mean, those are the kinds of things. Anytime I bend over, some of my clients will be at work, anytime I'm operating heavy machinery and I hear this, suddenly I'm back in Afghanistan being tortured. So it's more pieces, that are related to the senses and how they were either overstimulated or possibly, some understimulated that get held in the body. And it's images. Often we just remember really, pieces like a photographic essay, click, click, click. And they start to come together into a narrative. I don't necessarily think the whole narrative will ever be restored. It might, but it might not.
Mm-hmm.
So if it becomes a coherent memory, then we can usually say, hey, it's a memory. It's not happening now. And that's part of healing. That's part of the restorative process.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm actually, speaking of provocative questions, I'm going to ask some questions on the refugee crisis. I'm curious about what your perspective is on the current refugee crisis, and how can dance movement therapy and related practices be further incorporated to influence the current crisis and political climate?
This is going to sound like I'm joking, but I'm not. I was teaching a class in Austin, Texas in February, and one of the things that I integrate into my approach, which is called pote-mitan, it comes from a Creole word that translates literally as center post. It's a trauma and resiliency framework, but what it really means is center of all things. I mean, it's a really deep center. And I really integrate in dance therapy, use lots of expression, expressive movement, but there's a lot of structured activities and rest. Because rest is really hard for many survivors to find, rest states. And so I've been playing with actually honoring where the body is after meals, after lunch, it's in a rest and settle state. It's safe dorsal vagal, to use polyvagal terminology. And so one of the things I said is I felt that the whole White House should have nap times. Like, that's for dance movement therapy. I'd love to see actually some structured activities in the White House. I don't know if it would ever happen, where they actually learn to rest and settle. We tend to be more receptive. We tend to listen better. We tend to actually be more aware of our internal states. We can better interocept. And I always think we're much more truthful. We're going to speak the truth with much more accuracy when we speak from an interoceptive or an internal space, when we really know what's going on in our body. I don't think any of them know what's going on in their bodies. Mm-hmm. Refugee crisis, it's interesting because a colleague of mine who works at the Office of Refugee Resettlement asked me, would dance movement therapy be helpful for refugees as part of the, orientation when they first arrive, or as part of treatment? And I was like, both. Many refugees come from places that people don't go to a psychotherapist for psychotherapy. They might have psychologists and psychiatrists. They might use them for very specific reasons. Often it's very stigmatized. I mean, I've had some clients say, if you had to go to one of those doctors, you were crazy. And if you're not crazy, you don't even need to go to them. So there's a real black and white sense of it. Some of them go to traditional healers, shamans, imams, community leaders, rabbis, whoever it is. So the context for dealing with troubling, traumatic, stressful times is very different. So what dance movement therapy and all creative arts therapies, to be fair, offers is familiarity. When you think about displacement, talking about refugees, by definition, we're talking about displacement. They've been displaced from their place in the world, their home, their country, their culture, the place where everybody listens to the call to prayer, or everybody, eats a particular kind of food, where everybody sits down and they don't do drive-through, McDonald's or whatever it is. So talk about restoring a sense of belonging. The familiarity that dance movement therapy or another arts therapy can offer is really, really important, and probably underappreciated. And then again, it's what we know when we're working. I always say the body and biology is a universal. So culture has a huge impact on how we dress, whether we make eye contact or not, whether I move big or whether I move very quietly. And I think I've challenged dance therapy at many times throughout my career for making assumptions like, some of the theoretical approaches in dance therapy are based in very white Western world, so they don't necessarily apply. So we have to, recognize that culture is kind of what dresses us up, but there's a universality to biology, and that has to do with more of the physiological responses. I do a lot of psychoeducation with my clients. This is why your heart races. This is why you wake up at 3 a.m. This is, the role of the nervous system and the brain and how these pieces of memory are stored. And dance movement therapists, we have a strong physical, physiological, biological understanding of the body. That's part of our training more so than other behavioral or mental health professionals. I mean, maybe that's changing. So I think that's part of how it's relevant. But it's also, Marion Chase, who's considered the mother of dance therapy, talked about kinesthetic empathy. She coined that term. She was working with extreme psychosis, people who were locked, literally chained to the back wards of hospitals who nobody else could reach. And she recognized that if they were going like this with their head, maybe knocking it, and she did a similar movement, there would start to be a connection. And then, people would start to actually respond to her. And she was actually able to shift that into some spoken, some dialogue. So when we meet people at the level of the most basic form of communication, that's movement in the body, that's universal. I mean, there's so many ways that I think it can be helpful. And I think our ability to do community-based work. I've done a lot of large-scale community work with movement and the arts. And, a lot of people say, yeah, but that's not therapy. So maybe it's not constructed in the way that a usual therapy session is. It's certainly therapeutic. And now I'm kind of challenging. I'm like, yeah, it's not therapy. I'm like, how do we know that's not therapy? Who says what therapy is? Does therapy always have to be 50 minutes in outside four walls? I don't know. That's pretty privileged, if you ask me, quite honestly. So, if people get to do some community work, movement, sculptures, whatever it is, sure, it's not going to make all the problems go away. It's not going to bring back the people who were killed. It's not going to maybe make my insomnia and my nightmares go away. But maybe if I connect to other people, then I'll have the resources to go forward and continue. So, I mean, there's so many ways. That's a very exciting question, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talked about community and socially engaging, and I was wondering if you thought, do you think that movement can serve as a bridge between people's fear of change? So, for example, refugees entering into someone's country and them being afraid of this new culture entering, and a bridge between that and acceptance of the other.
These are great questions. These are really thoughtful questions. I think so. I have a feeling I'm going to answer this with what I'm thinking now and think of a bunch of things that I wish I said later. Absolutely. I mean, fear lives in our body, right? I mean, fear, it's an emotion, but it arises from a physiological process. That's what I was talking about, the shifts in the nervous system and the brain. So I teach, complex trauma, and this is in all complex trauma literature, calls for a phasic approach. And everybody's first stage or phase of their phasic approach is safety, or I like to call it relative safety and stabilization, because I think safety truly is relative. In that early part of treatment, I'm always teaching people, I have a whole series of structured processes or activities that I've created that up and down and side regulate, maybe shift you from mobilization and fear to more of a play-based mobilization without fear state. Maybe if you're really flat, up regulates you so that you've got a little more energy. Those practices can be really helpful. I mean, those can be bridges to people's literally being able to, if someone can self-regulate their body, if someone can restore a sense of mastery over how they respond to the environment so that they're not reacting, but they're responding to the environment, that's absolutely a bridge. I think a lot of misunderstandings happen when people react. Fear makes us more reactive, less responsive. I've seen so many times where law enforcement curious about, why somebody, a car is parked, or some of my clients have gone through, stop signs, or as they were learning to get used to driving in this new country, pulled over, and they completely freak out because they're terrified because it's somebody in a uniform. And all that law enforcement person could look, gosh, what's going on here? I want to find out. And then, it degenerates from there. I mean, the situation gets worse. So I think it absolutely could be a bridge. And even the way we respond, I think about being a refugee, which I've never been, speaking another language that maybe the people don't speak in the new country. Maybe I'm dressing differently. When I move towards somebody or approach, maybe I have a question, maybe I'm lost. Maybe I'm interested in something, and people often kind of pull back. I always invite people to think, how do you respond when you see somebody in the airport who's carrying the IOM bag, or you see somebody wearing a hijab? I mean, how do you respond? And if we're more, it doesn't have to be movement, facially expressive, if we express interest and curiosity, enthusiasm with our posture and our voice, that's a huge bridge to understanding.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like it's going back to interocepting. Starts with interoception of your own senses, your own body.
Yeah.
It sounds like physiological state shifting as well. So bridging your own states, and then that would lead to better bridging of the fear and acceptance of others.
Yeah, no, I think that's, interoception. I mean, when I was trained in dance movement therapy, of course, one of my greatest cues to what's going on with my clients is my own body. Why am I getting that nervous fluttering in my stomach? Why is my head suddenly hurting or feeling hot? Could be nothing. Could be that, I have a fever, but it could also be that there's something coming up. And I think the more pure and truthful we are about what's going on in our own body, the more we can check in and say, I'm just curious. I'm noticing that I'm feeling this way. What's going on for you? And that, that's also a bridge. Interoception, that self-knowing, I think allows us to be more mindfully present for our clients. And we're going to probably be more accurate in terms of what we sense about them and how we might, be listening to them and perceiving them. So what we offer might actually be more meaningful to them.
Well, there's a lot of similarities going on in social media. It seems to be an unstoppable force that exposes us to so much oppression and trauma occurring all around the world, like through the videos that automatically play when you go on social media, written reports, pictures. How do you suggest that people take care of their bodies in response to all the exposure?
I stay away. I'm so not interested in social media. And part of that is generational. I'm old enough that I'm trying to I feel like I'm trying to climb onto a raft in a really fascinating river sometimes. I can post on Facebook now. I still don't know how to. I just learned yesterday how to post a picture in a private message. So
congratulations.
I mean, I wish there was a way. I'm going to go back to something I saw in 60 Minutes in April about somebody. I don't remember his name, and I can't remember who interviewed him, but somebody who used to work at Apple and left because he actually recognized that they were intentionally creating iPhones and all of the stuff that goes on with all the social media and the alerts and stuff to be addictive, intentionally addictive. Mm-hmm. Social media. So the iPhones, but I think also social media. So I think we've got a huge challenge ahead of us because the lack of dimensionality of a device is no substitute for playing outside, playing in a sandbox, running around in the woods, going on picnics with a family. My sense is that young people are doing less of that and more of technological stuff. And it's not a substitute. And I think it's actually changing our nervous system. I actually proposed a disorder. I'm going to have to think of the name of it. It was after the terrible shooting in Norway on the island. And I can't remember the shooter's name. And it was, some of the things that happened with Columbine and other things where we recognized that a lot of violence seemed to be driven or informed by people spending a lot of time on computers in these virtual worlds and reading these manifestos, but also playing a lot of the violent games. And I know some people dismiss this, but I think there's, when people are young, 21, right? That's when the brain comes fully online. What are we doing to the wiring of the brain? I think I was calling it virtual reality perceptual disorder, where I actually think some of these acts of violence are arising from a rewiring of a system so that virtual is perceived as real. And so what we do online is really real. And so if we go out and we shoot up a theater full of people, that's a crass way to say it, it might not really be true. Like it's something that we can actually do and then just go back and play the game again. I don't know if that makes sense. Like that there's not a sense of kind of a physical finite reality with these virtual worlds. So, that really concerns me. And I think social media, I mean, I realize I went off on a big tangent, but social media, I just want to say to people, why would you do it more than an hour or two a day? Or what is it really useful for? I've been reading about the generation that, they just want so many likes that it's creating narcissism. Who's it up to? I mean, a lot of people say, well, it's up to parents, it's up to teachers. I mean, it's up to all of us. I think it's just recognizing that social media is really useful for transferring information quite quickly and efficiently. The Arab Spring, I mean, it's supported some amazing shifts on the planet, but it's not a substitute for the real, like, physical, tangible, palpable, sensory world. In fact, it dims the senses. So I think people should do what I do, which is like an hour a day on Facebook. I use it to rescue dogs because I love dogs. I post some things. I'm going to separate my personal from professional page and start posting my trainings on one. And, but it has a specific place in my life. But if I want to hang out, I'm not going to do it on Google. I'm going to go to like one of our cafes. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's some addicting. No, I was going to say there's also, I mean, it sounds like what you're suggesting is being intentional about being on social media, but there's also a lot of content of just real images or real videos of things happening, like, evidence of a cop shooting somebody or, just violence that's actually happening.
Yeah.
And I think that's addicting too.
Yeah. And I think it's replayed to be addictive. I mean, I don't think it's the image itself, because that could be responsible reporting. Hey, look at what actually happened here. In the past, before we had the ability to share this information, we had to believe what the newspaper said, right? Or we had to believe, he was a criminal, that's why he was shot, when actually it might have been racism. So we have more access to information. So it's not that it exists or that it's put out there, but maybe it should be put out there. Maybe it's the responsibility of whoever's putting it out there. Let's put it out. 24 hours it's available. See what really happened, then done. But they keep, it's the kind of, I always feel like it's a machine gun. They keep shooting images. It's the way that it's done, and I think that's intentional and addicting. It's not the piece itself. It can be very informative to see acts of violence. I think more people who live in la-la lands or bubbles, I think they need to see what's actually going on in the world. I get really self-righteous with some people. I don't want to see that movie because that happens in other countries. No, your taxes are actually paying for it. So maybe you should see that movie about torture. I'm thinking of Zero Dark 30. A lot of people are like, oh, makes the United States look bad. I heard it was really rough. It's like, yeah, if you're paying taxes, that's what you're doing. So go see the movie. There's a responsibility to seeing some of these images, but it's how I think they're put out there that's addictive.
Like, watch Zero Dark 30, but don't watch it
partition
30 times over.
Yeah.
Right.
But, we live in a country where I mean, we certainly have plenty of regulations, but people say, oh, well, that's against my right for free speech or free expression if I can't, put this image on, and have it available. But there's kind of a repetition compulsion that I think it's promoting. I remember I had a client who witnessed a beheading where he came from, and he walked around with it on his phone and just showed it to every provider he met. You've got to see what happened. And it was so clearly he was stuck in that loop, understandably. But, my work with him over 2 years, eventually I got him to delete that. That was one of my treatment goals, to delete that. You've seen it. I'm willing to watch it once. I'm willing to bear witness to what you experienced. Then I'm done. Now I know. And that was a whole therapeutic process. It was very powerful, actually. And he finally deleted it. It had served its purpose.
Reminds me of earlier when you talked about bringing back to the present moment.
Yeah. All the great spiritual teachers who, people write about or who have written great books. That's what they say, the present moment. That's all there is. And I don't think they're dismissing the fact that, we get here through whatever we've been through. So that's woven into what we're experiencing now. But at some point, there's is all that weaving together and, the path that I've walked, is that going to be a burden that's going to continue to pull me back? Or is it a reflection? Is it more like a mirror and I can look at it and say, yeah, there it is. part of me, but I don't have to carry it.
Mm-hmm. Those were all my questions. Thank you so much again. It was nice meeting you.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you all for listening. Again, this is the 10th episode, so that's really exciting. I'd love to continue having your support, and I'm open to your ideas of what you would like to continue listening about. So please visit the Facebook page, Mind Your Body, a Dance Movement Therapy Perspective. Thanks again. Bye-bye.